Latinoamérica del Global Development Network y antes de comenzar quisiera darle las gracias a todos por asistir, especialmente teniendo en cuenta que estamos comenzando fin de semana y que ayer varios de ustedes seguramente estuvieron en la cena fiesta que tuvimos que seguramente se prolongó hasta más allá de las 11 de la mañana. Entonces quiero darles un agradecimiento muy especial por haber asistido a esta sesión que vamos a tener en este momento que estamos dando comienzo, Researchers and Policymakers Bridging the Gap, que es patrocinada por la organización la cual coordino yo aquí para Latinoamérica. Ni la presentación ni yo vamos a ser los protagonistas de esta sesión. Para la sesión vamos a tener un excelente panel moderado por Santiago Gutiérrez. Entonces, antes de darle la palabra a ellos, quisiera darles un poquito de, o compartir con ustedes un poco de la historia que hay detrás de esta sesión que estamos a punto de comenzar con ellos. En primer lugar, para los que nos conocen y de pronto para los que no nos conocen, también quiero contarles un poco sobre el Global Development Network. Nosotros somos una organización internacional que se dedica a promover la generación, la diseminación y sobre todo promover muy fuertemente la incorporación de el conocimiento generado por la investigación en ciencias sociales a la formulación de las políticas públicas, de manera que las políticas públicas en los países emergentes y en vías de desarrollo sea una política pública informada. Somos una organización que surgió como un spin-off del Banco Mundial hace algo más de 10 años y cuyas oficinas principales están en la India y tenemos las oficinas dedicadas al manejo de nuestra red de investigadores en El Cairo. Muy en línea con la misión que tiene la organización de promover unas políticas públicas informadas con base en evidencia producida por la investigación, decidimos a principios de año desarrollar un estudio digamos bastante pragmático, digamos pragmático y de corte exploratorio, que lo que buscaba o cuya finalidad era estimular el debate alrededor de este tema, de cuáles son los procesos a través de los cuales las políticas públicas toman en cuenta la información generada por la investigación. Este fue un estudio que se basó en una metodología de caso, fue de tipo descriptivo y decidimos enfocarnos en las políticas públicas en salud. ¿Por qué políticas públicas en salud? Porque digamos es un campo que es altamente complejo, es técnico, tiende a tener formulación de políticas públicas que tienen impacto estructural y su alcance es de largo plazo y tienden a ser bastante estables. Elegimos como casos de estudio para tener, digamos, un estudio de corte comparado a El Salvador, Colombia y Uruguay para poder tener representatividad de las tres principales regiones de Latinoamérica, Centroamérica o Mesoamérica, la región andina y el Cono Sur. Este estudio lo que nos permitió fue abordar un tema, digamos, que ya ha sido bastante estudiado y en el que se trata de identificar cuáles son aquellos factores que facilitan o que dificultan la toma de información en la formulación de políticas públicas de conocimiento generado por la investigación. A través del estudio nosotros pudimos generar un ranking de estos facilitadores y estas barreras y quiero compartir con ustedes rápidamente para darle paso a nuestro panel de algunos de los resultados que encontramos. Nosotros identificamos o digamos testeamos 7 facilitadores identificados tanto en la literatura como en las entrevistas y encuestas que realizamos y encontramos que el facilitador o uno de los elementos que más ayuda a que en las políticas públicas se tenga en cuenta el conocimiento generado por la investigación es cuando existen relaciones fuertes y cercanas entre los formuladores de políticas públicas y los investigadores. En segundo lugar, encontramos que es de extrema importancia la existencia de bases de datos públicas que sean confiables, que permitan tomar decisiones rápidas. Y el tercer punto más importante fue que los investigadores estén en capacidad de generar documentos con claras implicaciones en las políticas públicas, de manera que estos sean atractivos para los tomadores de decisión. Como pueden ver, hubo otros facilitadores, no quiero meterme en detalle porque creo que esto los vamos a tocar durante el debate que vamos a tener. Asimismo, identificamos también unas barreras. Identificamos unas barreras y las ranqueamos. Encontramos que tal vez la barrera más fuerte que se presenta para la toma de información, de información de ciencias sociales generada en la investigación, en las políticas públicas, tiene que ver con todas las pujas que se dan a nivel de poder y por los presupuestos, la escasez de información relevante y oportuna para la toma de decisiones, y asimismo encontramos también que es de alta importancia la inestabilidad política y la alta rotación que se da al interior del gobierno y los entes encargados de la formulación de políticas públicas. A partir de este estudio, pensamos que puede ser una interesantísima oportunidad contar con una sesión en una conferencia de tan alto nivel como lo es la conferencia de la CEDALAMES, y ver cuál es la opinión de las personas que en el día a día están involucradas o tienen que vivir esta tensión que se da entre los dos mundos, el mundo de la investigación y el mundo de la formulación de las políticas públicas. Entonces, para eso juntamos un panel de expertos en el que vamos a tener representantes del sector de la formulación de las políticas públicas, del sector de la investigación y del sector de los tanques de pensamiento. No quiero hacer la presentación porque esta la va a hacer Santiago Gutiérrez, quien es director de Dinero.com, una de las publicaciones más prestigiosas de economía en Colombia. Y pues no siendo más, los dejo con Santiago Gutiérrez para que pasemos a tener este debate en el que espero pues que sea muy estimulante, se generen muchas ideas, y pues están invitados los participantes en la audiencia a también tomar parte de este conversatorio. Muchas gracias. Te dejo, Santiago, con la palabra. Dime.
Jorge, muchas gracias, Jorge. Mejor investigación para hacer mejores políticas, para hacer un mundo mejor, es lo que señalaba el estudio de Giri en alguno de sus apartes, y creo que eso es lo que vamos a tratar de encontrar, si efectivamente es una fórmula que se puede establecer y que se puede idear. El tema, como bien lo señalaba Jorge, pues es el de motivar el debate para encontrar cuáles son los factores que facilitan o entorpecen la transferencia de conocimiento entre la investigación académica y el diseño de la política pública, de un lado, encontrar facilitadores, encontrar barreras, saber qué tan importante es el aporte de la academia al diseño de la política pública, que en algunos casos vamos a encontrar, estoy seguro en la discusión que vamos a tener entre todos, vamos a encontrar que a veces es menos relevante de lo que quisiéramos que fuera, inclusive no por ausencia de investigación, sino por incapacidad de la herramienta. Y vamos a tratar de encontrar también casos específicos en los que uno puede utilizar de una mejor manera la investigación para mejorar la política pública. Entonces, para esto nos acompaña Solange Bernstein, que es superintendente de pensiones de Chile, doctorada en economía; Natalia Salazar, subdirectora de FEDesarrollo, el centro de investigación económico y social más importante que hay en el país; ex viceministra y una persona de una trayectoria en el sector público y en el sector privado tremendamente interesante; y Luis Carrizo, que es coordinador del tema preciso que nos convoca en este momento, que es de la investigación y la política pública del Centro Latinoamericano de Economía Humana de Uruguay. Entonces, quisiera tal vez proponerles el siguiente método para que podamos proseguir en esta reunión. Cada una de las personas va a hacer una presentación breve, 5 minutos, sobre la posición que tiene sobre este tema, y después lo que hacemos es abrir la sesión a preguntas. Yo voy a tomar un poco la iniciativa de hacer las preguntas, pero como decía Jorge, si alguno de ustedes tiene alguna pregunta, podemos simplemente hacerlas en el momento que ustedes lo consideren. Y vamos a hacer algunas preguntas para cada una de las personas, y después simplemente abrimos la discusión para que todos puedan opinar sobre las preguntas que se están planteando. Entonces, tal vez quisiera darle, si están de acuerdo, la palabra a Natalia para que nos cuente cuál es su posición sobre este tema.
Gracias, Santiago. Creo que uno debería comenzar diciendo que no toda la investigación pues tiene que ir orientada a a la política pública. Creo que hay una investigación que se debe hacer porque uno quiere expandir la frontera del conocimiento y hay un grupo de investigaciones que sí tratan digamos, problemas económicos de la vida de todos los días y, digamos, son esas a las que creemos que nos estamos refiriendo en este panel. Nos preguntaban cuáles son los facilitadores, cuáles son las grandes restricciones y cuáles son los medios para que, digamos, la investigación contribuya más a la formulación de políticas públicas. Acá creo que también hay varios niveles de influencia. Yo creo, o por lo menos desde la institución en la que yo trabajo, el fin principal es participar y motivar el debate público, poner temas sobre la mesa que de otra manera, digamos, sería muy difícil que aparecieran. Ya influir y moldear las decisiones de política pública, digamos, ese es uno de los propósitos de la investigación. Ahí es donde entran las restricciones de las que habla el documento del GDN y es más difícil, pero digamos el principal objetivo creo que es contribuir al debate, poner temas sobre las mesas y donde muchos sectores puedan discutir. Digamos, desde el punto de vista también de la entidad en la que he trabajado en el tema de investigación, creo que uno de los aportes más importantes o una de las contribuciones más importantes que pueden hacer las universidades y los centros de investigación es formando técnicos o de alguna manera también tecnócratas o gente muy calificada que luego va y trabaja en las entidades en las que toman decisiones de política económica, es decir, gente que, digamos, personas que pueden tomar directamente las decisiones como los ministros, los viceministros, pero creo que hay otro aporte muy importante y en FEDesarrollo lo vivimos todos los años. Muchos de nuestros investigadores junior y asistentes de investigación también pasan al gobierno a ser parte o a las instancias de decisión pública a ser parte de los equipos técnicos y equipos técnicos fuertes en las instituciones de política que toman decisiones de política, creo que es muy importante porque esos son mucho más permanentes. Si se forman equipos fuertes es muy difícil que, digamos, cambien por decisiones de política, las decisiones están más argumentadas en criterios técnicos y por supuesto estas personas son más permeables o están mirando qué es lo que está haciendo la investigación en el país y en el extranjero para, digamos, justificar las decisiones. Aquí nos falta mucho, por ejemplo, en el caso de Colombia, y me parece que el documento lo menciona, pero creo que es, por ejemplo, en el caso de Colombia, hay muchas instancias que toman decisiones con implicaciones económicas importantísimas, no solamente es el gobierno. Hablo en el caso específico del Congreso y en el caso específico de las altas cortes. Las altas cortes toman decisiones que son orden para los gobiernos de hacer cumplir. Ahí, digamos, la decisión o la discusión después de un fallo de la corte es muy difícil para el gobierno. Y lo que vemos es que no, los economistas, los investigadores, todavía no tenemos, la relación es todavía más lejana con las cortes y con el Congreso, con el gobierno. Y dentro del mismo gobierno creo que no hemos llegado a todas partes. Obviamente, digamos, las personas de las universidades, de los centros de investigación van a entidades eminentemente técnicas, como es el Banco Central, el Ministerio de Hacienda y el Planeación Nacional. Pero, digamos, hay otras entidades en donde todavía falta formar esos equipos técnicos o mandar gente muy bien formada a la toma de decisiones. Por ejemplo, el empleo en Colombia es uno de nuestros mayores problemas y el Ministerio de Empleo es el que más relación tiene con los trabajadores, con los sindicatos. Allí, digamos, no hay unos equipos técnicos todavía bien formados que ayuden a discutir las decisiones. Creo entonces que en el gobierno también nos falta, digamos, y llegar a algunos sitios. Otro insumo que creo que es muy importante es preservar la calidad técnica de la institución y su independencia. Este es el caso, por ejemplo, de FEDesarrollo. FEDesarrollo hace investigación académica, pero también hace investigación aplicada. Y acá lo más importante es la independencia de FEDesarrollo. Todo el mundo, digamos, reconoce que si FEDesarrollo está diciendo algo es porque tiene una visión independiente, no está, digamos, ¿cómo se logra eso? Y me parece que el documento del GDN tampoco digamos, lo trata a profundidad. Creo que acá hay un tema de financiación de la investigación que es muy importante en países como los nuestros. El fundraising en las universidades, en los centros de investigación todavía tiene camino por recorrer, y me parece que esa es la forma en cómo la investigación, la agenda de investigación puede ser mucho más autónoma en un centro de investigación y en una universidad. No depende tanto de la demanda que hagan el sector público o el sector privado o las multilaterales de demanda. Y por último, quisiera mencionar, por ejemplo, en FEDesarrollo tenemos una cláusula dentro de nuestros estatutos que ayuda muchísimo a preservar esa autonomía y esa independencia de FEDesarrollo, y es que todas las investigaciones que hagamos tienen que revelar el financiador y también tienen la obligación de estar en el dominio público. FEDesarrollo no guarda reservas sobre ningún estudio. Por eso perdemos muchas investigaciones, porque hay unos sectores que no están interesados en que se divulguen los resultados del estudio. Nosotros tenemos la obligación de divulgarlos, pero eso, digamos, ha hecho que la institución tenga una fuerza muy importante cuando sale a divulgar los resultados. Y en términos de los documentos orientados a políticas, creo que no solamente, y eso es algo que yo he discutido mucho con la gente de FEDesarrollo por la experiencia que tuve en el gobierno, y es no solamente tienen que ser documentos orientados a política, porque hay veces uno lo recibe desde el gobierno y uno ve que hay un montón de restricciones para adoptar la política sugerida por el documento de investigación. Creo que si bien las restricciones no son parte es decir, no, la investigación no debe partir de las restricciones presupuestales, institucionales, jurídicas, de todo estilo que tiene la toma de decisiones, pues yo sí creo que debe hacer una propuesta óptima, pero debe reconocer las restricciones que hay y también cómo puede actuar quienes toman la política, decisiones de política, cómo pueden adaptarse a esas decisiones. De golpe no es la política óptima, pero es el plan B o es una política subóptima. Creo que esos eran mis puntos.
Gracias, Natalia. Solange.
Hola, muy buenos días. Soy Solange Persten, como se dijo antes, y soy parte del gobierno de Chile. Soy superintendenta de pensiones, y en mi ámbito de competencia, en el cargo que llevo ya por 6 años, la superintendencia de pensiones aquí en Chile tiene el deber de supervisar y de regular al sistema de pensiones y de seguro de cesantía, que son ámbitos de política que efectivamente han tenido reformas en el caso chileno en los últimos años, y en ese ejercicio, digamos, de hacer política económica en estos ámbitos, me ha tocado participar en reformas en las cuales hemos tenido una cercana relación con organismos de investigación, y un poco contarles mi experiencia. Y desde esa experiencia yo creo que efectivamente enriquece muchísimo el análisis de la política económica el tener a disposición investigación relevante. Por lo tanto, hay, digamos, un beneficio mutuo para investigadores y para quienes hacen política económica el que exista esta relación y este puente entre ambos ámbitos. En ese sentido, yo creo que es evidente que se pueden construir relaciones que ayuden a que la política económica sea cercana a lo que es la investigación. Sin embargo, siempre van a quedar algunos elementos que van a impedir una completa interacción. En el caso de la reforma de pensiones en el año 2008 en Chile, yo creo que fue un ejercicio que no está incluido en este reporte porque está más centrado en el ámbito de salud, pero que refleja un poco el cómo se hizo en el caso de Chile, donde hubo efectivamente muchísima interacción entre el ámbito académico y quienes diseñaron la política. En ese sentido, en términos de la agenda, de los temas a discutir, yo creo que la Superintendencia de Pensiones, tal como lo decía Natalia hace un rato atrás, hizo un esfuerzo muy importante en incluir técnicos un departamento de investigación dentro de la superintendencia con capacidades de análisis, y no solamente capacidades de análisis de información existente, sino que además el construir bases de datos relevantes para el análisis. Yo creo que eso es uno de los elementos también muy importantes para que haga esta conexión entre investigadores y quienes diseñan política, el que existan datos. Y esos datos muchas veces pueden ser levantados por quienes están en instituciones de gobierno, y en ese sentido la disposición de datos en forma pública que permita hacer investigación, yo creo que es un elemento muy relevante. Y para eso también se requieren competencias técnicas en las organizaciones públicas, porque son quienes levantan información, y para que la información que levanten sea relevante también para hacer investigación, es necesario que las personas que la estén construyendo tengan las capacidades necesarias. Así también, en el caso de la reforma del sistema chileno de pensiones, se hicieron varios seminarios en conjunto entre la Superintendencia de Pensiones y think tanks en el caso chileno. Tenemos al Centro de Estudios Públicos y a Expansiva, donde efectivamente se hicieron seminarios conjuntos, donde se fijó la agenda en forma conjunta entre la superintendencia y estos think tanks. Se contrataron artículos técnicos que fueron parte de estas discusiones. Y eso también es muy relevante, que existan estas conversaciones en el diseño de seminarios, de tal manera que los tópicos que se toquen en estos eventos sean de relevancia para el diseño de política. Algunas de las dificultades con que uno se encuentra son que muchas veces justamente las instituciones públicas no recogen información estadística suficiente, no tienen data administrativa diseñada para hacer diseño de política. Y en ese sentido, el construir esa información ex post es sumamente difícil. Por lo tanto, esa es una de las barreras, yo creo, importantes. Y además hacer, por ejemplo, encuestas también es bastante caro. En el caso de Chile en particular, se hizo una encuesta de protección social que ha servido para el diseño de política. Eso empezó el año 2002 con la primera encuesta, 2004 es una encuesta de tipo panel, que yo creo que es sumamente útil hacer este tipo de encuestas tipo panel, seguirlas en el tiempo, ser consistentes con la metodología, de tal manera de tener información para hacer diseño de política, pero también data administrativa, los datos que se pueden recoger en forma administrativa. Luego están los temas que también son una especie de barrera en algún sentido, que es la sensibilidad política a ciertos temas. Por lo tanto, cuando se hace investigación, sobre todo solicitada por el gobierno a instituciones técnicas, muchas veces los diagnósticos que se levantan pueden gatillar eventos o presiones en términos de avanzar en ciertas materias, y si bien se está consciente de un diagnóstico y hay un diagnóstico acordado, el diseño de las soluciones puede requerir tiempo. Y una vez que se levantan los temas y se levanta un diagnóstico, los tiempos se apuran, y se apuran de una manera tal que muchas veces el diseño de la respuesta de política frente al problema que se ha detectado no es óptima, porque el tema simplemente se apura y si es necesario salir con soluciones rápidas. En el caso de Chile, eso se fue controlando con la reforma previsional, que es un tema altamente sensible, y se tenía mucho estudio previo. Luego, en la formulación de política y la legitimación, yo creo que también es un tema muy importante, y tal como se mencionó antes también, el que hayan organismos independientes que tengan estudios, que den soporte a las líneas de acción del gobierno, la valida. Y es muy difícil cuando uno llega al Congreso y tiene un respaldo técnico no discutible, con bases sólidas, en base a datos respecto de cuáles son las políticas que es adecuado para un país, facilita muchísimo la discusión y el cómo se lleva a cabo entonces tanto el diseño como la discusión luego parlamentaria de un cambio legislativo. En ese sentido, también en el caso chileno hubo un comité que creó la presidenta Bachelet en su oportunidad, en la cual participaron académicos y que validaron un poco la línea que se está adoptando por parte del gobierno. Se hizo incluso un seminario internacional donde se trajeron académicos de diferentes partes del mundo que también dieron su opinión en un seminario abierto respecto de cuáles eran las líneas de acción en esa oportunidad, así como también unas reuniones privadas que hubo con quienes formaron parte del comité. Ese tipo de interacción yo creo que también es sumamente útil y ayuda a la formulación de política y además a la legitimación de las políticas que se van adoptando. Algunas barreras, lógicamente, son que hay visiones distintas y muchas veces esas visiones no tienen, no necesariamente tienen un trasfondo técnico, sino que también tienen un trasfondo de opinión, de prejuicios por parte de los distintos actores. Por lo tanto, llegar a consenso no siempre es un tema netamente técnico. Respecto a la implementación de política, es luego importante cuál es el material con que se cuenta, cuáles son los estudios con que se cuenta y que estén disponibles. Porque cuando ya se llega a la fase de implementar una política, en general los tiempos ya están muy apurados. Por lo tanto, ya las posibilidades de interactuar entre la academia y quienes están haciendo el diseño de política, una vez que ya el tema está sobre la mesa, que se ha discutido y que es necesario implementar, las implementaciones en general tienen que ser muy rápidas. Por lo tanto, al momento de hacer los diseños, de levantar los temas y hacer los diagnósticos, inmediatamente se debe pensar en la fase de implementación, de tal manera de que cuando se llegue a esa etapa, todo el material esté disponible para poder seguir avanzando. En el caso chileno, de la reforma previsional en particular, había muchísimo material. Un tema también muy importante respecto de la evaluación de política y los cambios que después se vayan diseñando frente a una política ya implementada, son de nuevo el tema de los datos. Cuando se implementa una política es importante pensar en que esa política debe ser evaluada después. Porque cuando después uno quiere evaluar una política que no fue pensado el que tenía que ser evaluada, no están los mecanismos para poder hacer una evaluación adecuada. No están los datos, no están las instituciones, por lo tanto, en ese sentido es una cosa que es importante pensar desde un principio. En el caso de Chile en particular, en la reforma previsional, hay datos administrativos que se empezaron a levantar, pero el año 1981, cuando fue la primera reforma previsional que cambió el sistema de reparto por un sistema de capitalización, no estaba eso presente y no habían datos al año 2002, cuando se quiso empezar a levantar, la información hubo que recogerla por una información que tenía una antigüedad de 20 años. Resulta bastante difícil a esas alturas empezar a construirla. Por lo tanto, ese es un elemento muy importante al momento de implementar, que se piense en que se debe evaluar. En el caso de Chile, como decía, el gobierno incluso encargó estudios de evaluación de política a instituciones académicas y en ese sentido eso también ayuda, el que se piense en políticas claras y que se evalúen. Y la misma Superintendencia de Pensiones también está publicando estadísticas y análisis de evaluación que tienen un nivel de profundidad no mayor y que permite y da espacio a que cada uno de los elementos que nosotros estamos haciendo presentes a la comunidad puedan ser explorados con mayor profundidad por investigadores y académicos. Están los datos, están las preguntas, están evaluaciones en términos de estadística, por lo tanto abre espacios para nuevos estudios. En términos de barreras, luego, nuevamente tenemos los temas de sensibilidad que se levantan frente a temas como el tema de pensiones, que es un tema altamente sensible, sobre todo en épocas, por ejemplo, como las que estamos viviendo en estos días de turbulencia financiera, con un gran impacto sobre los fondos de pensiones, sobre los ahorros de los trabajadores, en los cuales cualquier tema de discusión que se levante puede ser utilizado o puede ser entendido de una manera equivocada. Por lo tanto, hay que ser bastante cuidadoso en ese sentido respecto de cómo se van tratando los temas por la alta sensibilidad que estos pueden tener. Y en ese sentido, la comunicación con la academia debe ser, digamos, en ese contexto. En general, entonces, yo creo que de los puntos que quisiera destacar es la disponibilidad de información, la existencia de comunicación entre investigadores y quienes hacen política, con la generación de investigación conjunta, seminarios conjuntos, también que el mismo gobierno produzca investigación con fortaleza importante respecto a sus propios equipos. Y respecto de las barreras, son los temas de sensibilidad política muchas veces respecto de los temas, falta de muchas veces también de entender la importancia de la investigación académica para la formulación de política por parte de quienes la construyen y a su vez de parte de las instituciones de investigación, a veces también desconocimiento de las instituciones públicas y de las limitaciones o de las restricciones de las cuales hablábamos hace un rato atrás, que no podemos construir en el vacío, tenemos que construir dentro de los marcos que existen. Y los tiempos siempre son un problema, así que los tiempos también influyen. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un enorme gusto estar acá en representación del Centro Latinoamericano de Economía Humana. Queremos en primer término agradecer a los organizadores, a la CEA, a la AMES y en especial en esta mesa a GDN, la cordialísima invitación que nos hicieron llegar, y a nuestro amigo Jorge Barriga las felicitaciones por el estudio realizado que nos estimula, nos provoca a un tema que en lo personal me suena muy apasionante, más allá de que a primera vista pueda sonar árido. Para nosotros es un desafío permanente, cotidiano, el tratar de discernir cuáles son las distintas dimensiones que están operando en este diálogo entre investigación y políticas públicas. De hecho, para nosotros ese es un objeto de estudio. Nosotros queremos discernir, investigar, explorar cuáles son las distintas maneras como este diálogo se produce. Primero partimos de la base de que es muy importante para el diseño, la implementación, la evaluación de las políticas públicas, contar con información relevante en el momento oportuno. Esa es la hipótesis de base, y esa hipótesis está en el debate internacional hace muchos años, hace varias décadas, podríamos decir fundamentalmente en este último periodo de los años 70 del siglo pasado, pero también nos interesa discernir las particularidades de este gran título, Enlace, Investigación y Políticas Públicas. ¿Por qué? Bueno, porque efectivamente estamos tocando terrenos muy sensibles y muy diversos, especialmente cuando hablamos de América Latina. Es cierto que la literatura más frecuente en estos temas, que abordan estos temas, vienen de la academia del norte, de distintos países, Estados Unidos, Gran Bretaña, pero en América Latina hay una realidad distinta del norte y además diversa en sí, con un gran horizonte de variabilidad en cuanto a las culturas políticas de distintos países, de distintas regiones. Entonces, una primera advertencia es decir, cuando hablamos del nexo entre investigación y políticas públicas, tenemos que situarlo geográfica e históricamente. Hay una cosa que tiene que quedar clara en la cabeza del investigador, es que los resultados así colocados como si fuera un resultado estrictamente académico no es un insumo útil para el decisor político. Si lo hace él, finalmente, las recomendaciones, o lo trabaja con un experto en comunicación institucional o política, bueno, esas son estrategias que cada quien y cada institución puede elegir, pero lo que tiene que quedar claro es que, como me decía una alta autoridad del ámbito de la salud en Uruguay, me decía, yo siempre espero, después de las 400 páginas de una tesis específica sobre salud pública, espero esas 3 páginas de recomendaciones que nunca llegan. Y a mí me parece que eso es un mensaje que desde un decisor político preocupado por contar con información relevante y útil en el momento indicado, tiene que llegar a los investigadores. No sé si cada investigador tendrá que traducir sus propios resultados o discutirlos con alguien que tenga expertise en comunicación institucional y política, pero estas son estrategias que tienen que estar dentro del horizonte posible de funciones, de tareas o de preocupaciones del investigador y su institución.
Estamos llegando al final de este debate, entonces yo le quisiera pedir a cada uno de los panelistas que hicieran un breve resumen, un par de minutos, sobre lo que consideran que deberían ser las conclusiones importantes que quizás la CEA, GIRIEN, que han promovido esta iniciativa, este debate, se pudieran llevar para empezar una segunda fase en esta tarea de acercar a los investigadores académicos con quienes hacen los diseños de política. Entonces, Natalia, quisiera invitarte entonces a hacer ese primer resumen.
Gracias, Santiago. No, pues a mí me parece que esta discusión es absolutamente clave. Yo creo que en general en América Latina hemos ido en el sentido correcto, digamos, hemos podido llegar a tener relaciones cercanas con ciertas entidades en donde se toman decisiones. Creo que nos hace falta, digamos, de golpe en la forma, de golpe llegar a todos los que toman decisiones, no solamente el gobierno. Hay muchas instancias, insisto, en el caso de Colombia, hay muchas instancias que toman decisiones y que, digamos, deberíamos también tratar de ver cómo podríamos llegar a cómo podríamos tener un diálogo con esas otras instancias que toman decisiones.
Bueno, yo creo que como aquí lo hemos repetido, enriquece la formulación de política, la interacción con investigadores, con centros de investigación y a su vez la misma investigación, el saber que un investigador está contribuyendo a una mejor sociedad debería ser una motivación también para los investigadores para emprender un camino que efectivamente se convierta en una contribución. Así que en ese sentido el trabajo que se haga teniendo ese horizonte, yo creo que contribuye a una mejor sociedad. Así que muy bienvenido la investigación que están haciendo y yo creo que es crítico y crucial. Como decía yo, la información y el diálogo son esenciales.
Sí, yo señalaría una síntesis de dos puntos en donde colocaría por un lado la necesidad de seguir fortaleciendo las capacidades de los investigadores y sus instituciones para la toma de conciencia y la incidencia en el diseño de políticas a partir de la información. Y segundo, y en eso GIRIEN ha estado, si esto es un mensaje a GIRIEN, yo creo que eso lo subraya de la misma manera que subrayaría la importancia de estudiar las culturas políticas y los procesos de los ciclos de políticas y los actores en cada caso, porque también depende allí cómo manejarse. En eso el estudio que nos presentó GIRIEN y Jorge Barriga nos han ilustrado muy bien acerca de tres experiencias en reformas de salud en América Latina que tienen particularidades, y esto lo quiero subrayar porque no hay modelos únicos. Hay sí referencias, pero que tienen que ser muy en diálogo, como decía Solange, con el mundo real, con la gente que está, y como también decía Natalia, con los beneficiarios, con quienes reciben finalmente los resultados de estas políticas, que son los que interesan en el medio del asunto.
Mejor investigación para mejores políticas, para hacer un mejor mundo, el mensaje que nos daba el estudio con el que empezamos esta presentación. Creo que ese tema va a seguir rondando en el ambiente en el próximo año, cuando posiblemente nos volvamos a reunir para discutir los avances de ese tema. Muchas gracias a los tres panelistas, yo creo que ha sido tremendamente interesante el aporte que han hecho en esta discusión. Muchas gracias a ustedes, sobrevivientes de la fiesta de anoche, por acompañarnos, y de nuevo a la CEA, muchas gracias por la invitación.
Could you please take your seats? We're going to begin because we are running a few minutes late. Well, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Sendel Mullainathan. I have to say that I find especially appropriate that LASEA is asking him to deliver this year's Albert O. Hirschman's lecture, because his work shares at least two of the major characteristics of Hirschman's contribution. First and foremost, Hirschman's work was characterized by an interdisciplinary approach to development problems. Let me recall the audience, among other examples, his 1970 book on exit, voice, and loyalty, his 1981 book on essays in trespassing, economics to politics and beyond, and his last published book, Crossing Boundaries, in 1998. Most of you were not born when these books were published, but believe me that for the economists of my generation, each of them were as path-breaking as each new record of the Beatles. If you have not done so, I recommend that you read them. Otherwise, I recommend that you read them again. You will enjoy them as much as hearing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, either for the first time or once more. But rereading Hirschman's is just not pleasant, but useful. His exit and voice framework, for example, can be fruitfully applied to analyze issues like when and why vouchers or parents' participation in school boards can work in some situations and not in others. Or as Bill Maloney and I did in our 2005 Informality, Exit and Exclusion book, to understand when and why many firms and workers opt out of formality and how can such a decision be reversed through policy actions. The title of the last of Hirschman's book, Crossing Boundaries, aptly describes Sendel's diverse contributions integrating psychology and economics. Let me recall especially his development economics through the lens of psychology of 2006 and his psychology and development economics of 2007, as well as the many applications of psychology and the new field of behavioral economics that Sendel has brilliantly contributed to the analysis of poverty, labor, finance, tax, savings, and consumer behavior issues. Just to quote a few titles: Helping Consumers Know Themselves, 2011, Self-Control and the Development of Work Arrangements, 2010, Why Don't People Insure Late Life Consumption, 2008. The second characteristic that Sendel's work shared with the contributions of Hirschman is his passion for analyzing how policies work in practice and extracting from there and the application of interdisciplinary conceptual frameworks highly innovative policy approaches to fostering development. Hirschman's 1963 Journeys Toward Progress, Studies of Economic Policymaking in Latin America, 1967 Development Projects Observed, and 1985 A Bias for Hope, Essays on Development in Latin America, to quote just a few, are outstanding examples of such a passion in Hirschman's work. The first two of these were strongly influenced by his many years of work in the 50s and 60s in my own country, Colombia, and his profound observations on how policies really worked in the institutional, cultural, and political environment of a Latin American country in those times. Sendel's contribution on how anti-poverty, microfinance, tax, and labor market-specific policies actually work in practice, 3 years that is the first time that he's presenting it to a public like this. So let me leave you with Sendel Mullainathan and ask for an applause.
Before I get started, that would be a good thing not to do. Oh, now it's on. Okay. Let me just start by saying that I feel like speakers always do this, but what I'm about to say is truly heartfelt. When I was an undergraduate thinking about what I would do, whether I would do economics or not, there were two scholars who had a profound impact on me. One of them was Thomas Schelling, and the other was Albert Hirschman. I remember reading his books, Development Projects Observed, fabulous book. Exit, Voice, and Loyalty was particularly moving. And so it's personally very gratifying. Like I'm echoing. It's personally very gratifying to be giving the Hirschman lecture. And I think the words, a phrase he used quite frequently in his later books, which I really liked, was intellectual trespass. It's a nice phrase, intellectual trespass. And that stayed with me through most of my career as something that I always aspired to do. And so this, what I'm going to present to you, is the ultimate intellectual trespass. It's work I've been doing for the last, is there a way to get rid of this echo? I don't know if there's, I feel like I'm speaking from high up on a mountain. Now, that's everyone's dream, I suppose, but what I'm going to present today is truly a case of intellectual trespass. It's joint work with Eldar Shafir and quite a few other people. It really represents about 3 years of work of digging very deep into the question of what does it mean to be poor? What goes on inside the mind during conditions of poverty? And what is the psychology of poverty really all about? And you're going to see a lot of trespass today. I'm going to go from lab experiments with Princeton undergraduates all the way to field studies and field experiments. And though the methods are diverse, much like Hirschman, I think what's emerging from the diversity of methods is a very precise story about what it means to be poor. So I always joke that modern development economics is about starting with a picture of a poor person. So this is a picture of a poor person. And this is a good person to start our story with. This is from joint work I did with Dean Carlin. And it really was the beginning of my thinking on this topic. At least it started me thinking there's something I'm missing. And so this is a vegetable vendor. The business model of a vegetable vendor is very, very simple. She gets up early in the morning. That's her business right there. You can see very little capital. Those crates are pretty cheap. Her only capital is her working capital, those fruits. She gets up very early in the morning, buys those fruits, let's say 1,000 rupees worth of fruit, brings it to this corner, sells it during the day. Let's say she sells it for 1,100 rupees. Her gross profit is 100 rupees. That's like $2, let's say. Now, what's interesting about the vendor is that her biggest input is working capital, 1,000 rupees. And what we were finding is that many of these vendors, say 2/3 of these vendors, got their working capital by borrowing it. So what would they do? They would go in the morning when they would buy the fruit, they would also borrow the 1,000 rupees. And at the end of the day, they pay back the 1,000 rupees. This is literally a loan that has a horizon of 1 day. And what was the interest rate? Is it my phone, you think? You think so? All right, let's try that. Is that better? Okay, at least no feedback. Oh, wow. That's pretty good. I hope you're in the IT sector. There's a lot of money there. Okay, she's got about 100 rupees of gross profit. She borrows this 1,000 rupees every day. The daily loan that she takes has an interest rate of 5% per day. So of the 1,000 rupees, 50 rupees goes to servicing the interest rate. So half of her income. It's pretty striking for somebody living on $2 a day for $1 just to go to interest. Now, looking at this, our first instinct is to say, why is the market so screwed up? Why is the interest rate so high? Let's put that aside. Let's ask ourselves, why does this woman continue to borrow at such high interest rates? So striking is this that if she did one simple thing, if she simply took a cup of tea less a day, so she took 3 rupees, that's about how much a cup of tea costs, she put it aside and she borrowed 997 on the first day. And she put aside another 3, 994. If she continued this way, in about 30 days, she'd be debt-free. Why is it 30 days? That's compounding. She's not just putting aside 3 rupees a day, she's not borrowing 5% a day either. So in 30 days, she has a trivial strategy for doubling her income. Imagine that we said, I've got an anti-poverty program that's gonna double the income of a person living at $1 a day. All they have to do is not drink tea, or not have a dosa, or not have a snack for 30 days, and we will have doubled their income. That's striking. But moving beyond it as a poverty program, what does it tell us about her that she's not following this strategy? When you dig a little deeper, what you realize is there's a lot of things about the poor that have this feature, okay? I'm gonna show you another example. Totally different context, totally different behavior. This is the behavior of diabetics in the United States. Diabetes is a terrible illness, but luckily, in today's society, it's treatable. All you have to do is take a certain, depending at the level you're at, take a certain injection or a pill every day, okay? Easy enough. If you don't do that, you risk blindness, losing a limb, death. It's pretty ugly. Despite that, one thing emerges a lot. About 50,000 limbs are lost every year in the United States because of diabetes, and most of it is completely controllable, and the vast majority of it happens amongst the poor. Why? Because they don't take their medication regularly. Is it income? No, because they are all on Medicaid, and the income and the medication is free. So once again, we see a particularly bizarre behavior by the poor. Something simple they can do, take the injection every day, which has pretty striking consequences, and yet the poor are making a mistake and screwing it up. Okay, I'll give you one more example and then we'll move on. But I can come up with literally dozens of these examples. Here's one, again from the United States. Sociologists have studied parenting behaviors of the poor and of the rich. And the way they do this is pretty interesting. They send somebody to sometimes live in the person's home, kind of surreptitiously. They just sit there in the evenings, they become part of the family, and they just take notes on how they're parenting. Sometimes they bring them into like a little preschool-like environment, and then they videotape and watch the interaction of the parents. They have a lot of different methods for it. And these sociologists are pretty liberal people, so it's striking, liberal not in the American sense of the word. They're pro-poor, they're friendly to the poor, they like the poor. So it's pretty striking that what their data shows is actually pretty, it doesn't make the poor look particularly good. What they show consistently in study after study is that the poor are terrible parents. They're harsher with their children. Worse, they're most inconsistent. They're harsh about one thing and then they don't notice another thing. They sit their kids in front of televisions and just don't do anything. They don't read to their children. They don't spend quality time with their children. They don't engage. So where am I going all this? I'm going with all this with something which I quickly came to see is sort of the elephant in the room in the work on poverty. It's the thing that we often don't really want to talk about. It's the issue that for me became very clear that was surrounding the psychology and the behavior of the poor, which is if you look at the data across a variety of domains, whether it's parenting behavior, financial behavior, health behavior, we could go on and on. If I were to summarize it, I would say the elephant in the room is that the poor screw up. They just seem to do a bad job. They just don't seem to be very good at a lot of things we need them to be good at. And this is the elephant in the room mainly because this type of thinking has a pretty bad history. We've known for quite some time that poverty seems related to behavior, but nobody wants to come out and say it so starkly because the minute I said it, think of your reaction. You're thinking, here's this guy who's now going to tell me the poor are stupid people. In fact, I am probably going to show you something like that, but not what you think. So here's how we often think about it. The poor, there's some relation to behavior. There's a bunch of people who've done literature and work that says, yes, the poor screw up. And they screw up because they're lazy, they're incompetent, they lack intelligence, they lack limited ability. There's a bunch of other stuff which says, no, it's poor socialization, it's deviant values. No, it's political representation, it's education, it's financial literacy, it's health, it's There's a lot of ways to connect these two lines. Okay, what I want to tell you is I think there is a much simpler, more basic connection between poverty and behavior, which I think will help us understand exactly why we see so many weird behaviors amongst the poor, and will give us, I think, some handle on what to do about the whole thing. So to do that, I want to take us back to 1943. In 1943, World War II was on, and if you were a pacifist during World War II, you were pretty conflicted. You were conflicted because clearly this felt like a good war to be in, but you didn't feel comfortable fighting. So you were looking for something to do. One of the things you could do is you could participate in experiments. And there was one such experiment on, which is there was a concern that as the war dragged on, people would get fewer and fewer rations, and they'd be eating less and less. So scientists said, let's get ahead of this and figure out what happens when people are hungry. So they recruited a bunch of pacifist, conscientious objectors to participate in what's called the Minnesota Hunger Study. It's still one of the best long-term studies we have of the impact of hunger. And in the Minnesota Hunger Study, they literally brought these populations down to very low calorie counts. Now, a lot of the things that you might imagine happened. People lost weight. Okay, big deal. But one of the things that happened, and there's a beautiful book on this that's all worth reading, and if you don't want to read the original book, there's a nice book called Hunger, which has just come out, which is very worth reading. But, you know, the fact that they could run less far, the fact that they lost weight, that's all predicted. But something happened in this study that was very weird and I think has been largely overlooked. The minds of the people who were hungry changed, okay? How did it change? For example, these gentlemen would start studying cookbooks in their free time. That's what they would do. Here's another thing they would do. They would pick up newspapers and look at the prices of food and compare the prices of food. I think roughly over 50% when asked, what do you plan to do after you leave the study, said, I'm going to open a restaurant. In other words, food, the thing they lacked, was also the thing, not that they lacked in a physical sense, but in a mental sense, was the thing that was on top of their mind. The lack in the world became a prominence in the mind. 50 years later, there was an interesting study by psychologists. They weren't really thinking about scarcity, they were just interested for a different reason, which we can talk about later if people are interested. They did an experiment that I think is very telling. They brought subjects into the lab and they told them, we'd like, before you come, don't drink water for like 6 hours. So they all showed up thirsty. And the fun thing about a psychologist is that you can have fun with your subjects. So half the subjects they gave water to, and the other half said, hey, before we start the experiment, here are some pretzels. So now we have some very thirsty people and some not so thirsty people. This is not the hunger experiment. These aren't people who've been under hunger for like 6 months. This is guys who are thirsty, pretty thirsty. Speaking of which, I am thirsty. That's called priming. And here's the experiment they did. They gave them what's called the lexical decision task. The lexical decision task is an interesting cognitive measure of what's on top of mind, but at a level that is faster than you can consciously control. It happens at the 100 millisecond range, roughly. And here's how it works. Letters flash on the screen, and based on the letters, you have to hit a button if it's a word, and hit another button if it's not a word. That's it. So you see the JSKA, you hit the other button, it's not a word. Though it may be a Norwegian word, I have no idea. But this is in the US, so as far as English is concerned. Then you hit another button. Blah, 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 and then these words just keep flashing by. And the way this study works is lexical decision tasks are a good way of knowing what's on top of mind because people will hit words that are on top of mind faster by 50 milliseconds. They're just quicker to respond. It's happening very fast. You yourself may not be fully aware of it. And what these authors found was that when people were thirsty, they responded to the word water, soda, words involving their thirst much faster than to words like, they were no slower on words like chair. They were simply very fast on the words that were on top of mind. So you can see from two very different perspectives, we start to understand something about poverty, or at least about hunger and thirst, that it doesn't simply have a neutral effect on the body, that it appears to make the things that we lack move to the top. At the time I was thinking of this, reading this literature, trying to understand it, something happened to me that was pretty funny. This is a State Bank of India ATM in Chennai. I was doing field work in Chennai, And it was a Sunday, and I was very happy because all my research assistants were gone. There was no one around to bug me. Finally, I'd have free time to myself. I woke up early, I went to the gym, I worked out really hard, I was thirsty. As I walked back home, I thought I'd stop at the local store and get some water and, slake my thirst. Then I realized I had no cash, but I had my ATM card. So I went to this ATM, put it in, and I don't know if you guys, for those of you who travel a lot internationally, this probably has happened to you. The bank, as a favor to you, cancels your ATM card or blocks it at arbitrary times. Yes. So on this thirsty, I'm hungry, Sunday morning, they did me this favor. I go to the ATM machine, doesn't work. And I'm like, I'm really screwed. I have nobody in town I can call for money, and I have literally 20 rupees for the entire day. That's even less than the vendor. And for me, it's just a lot less, because even a bottle of water, which I can't just drink water out of the tap, costs like 10 rupees, 8 to 10 rupees. So I went to the store to buy the water and trying to figure out what to do. What was so interesting in that moment was that that store, which I'd been to 30 times to that point, was a very different store. Things were really popping out at me. Oh, I would really love that. But if I bought that, I can't have that. These things, which simply would normally come and go, were now prominent and persistent. Even after I said, I can't afford that chicky. Chicky is this like peanut and sugar concoction that's very delicious, and now I wish I had some. Shouldn't have talked about it. Became very prominent, and I said, I can't afford that because that's 5 rupees. That would be half of my post-water consumption on this thing. I can't afford it. But it's like still kept calling out at me. All of this led to what I'm now going to tell you is kind of a very basic theory of what happens inside the mind when it experiences a lack of something. And I won't have time today, but what I want to do is to take us back to basic utility theory. And in fact, this is something that the vast majority of the sciences, psychology, sociology, they all agree on the following view of utility. That what separates wants from needs is diminishing marginal utility. There are things we really need, they have very high return. There are things we want, they're more, further out the diminishing utility curve. Where the social sciences differ is in the capacity of the mind to be efficacious in going out and acquiring the needs and acquiring the wants. That's what a lot of behavioral economics is about. The mind might be not so good at acquiring wants and needs, but we agree there's the mind and there's wants and needs. What I want to argue is this separation is not there. That the psychology of want is very different than the psychology of need. That when needs are there, the mind itself changes. And the way I want to kind of give you an intuition about this, the way it seems to change is that wants come and go. If you picture the mind as sort of a blank canvas, and you think of somebody engaging in a monthly, their day-to-day purchases of the month. They say, I need groceries. They go to the grocery store. They buy the groceries they need. It's gone from their mind. I need to get gas. I get the gas I need. Gone from the mind. I have a credit card bill. All right, I'll pay it. Gone. Here's this pink house that I have to pay a mortgage on. Okay, well, there's my pink house. Here's an iPhone app called Fruit Ninja that I need to buy. I buy it. And you notice wants come and they go, and my mind is relatively free. Think of a similar situation for a poor person. Having less means you go to the grocery store. That's not small now. That need has become bigger. It's more prominent. It also doesn't go, because after all, at the grocery store, you don't simply just buy the stuff you want and forget about it. There are tough trade-offs to be made. Well, if I buy groceries, what am I going to do about gas this month? If I buy gas this month, what about the mortgage this month? So needs start to crowd the mind. And when they crowd the mind, they do two things which are important. One, in this visual illustration, they leave less space for other stuff. This is a pretty fully packed mind. Second, other stuff moves to the background. Fruit Ninja is not even something I'm going to be thinking about. And that's kind of efficient. Why should you be thinking about Fruit Ninja? But that credit card bill is also something I'm not going to be thinking about, because it's not a need right now. I can always put it off. So these two features, the crowding of the mind with needs and the receding of other wants or other things into the background, are two features that I think are pretty important. And so I want you to kind of understand these I'll tell you one more interesting story and then we'll get to some data. The story I want to tell you is, and I think this is the cleanest way to see a lot of this, is that as a result, the choices we make under conditions of need are framed very differently. So I'll give you the first example of this. Imagine you go to a bar, or you go to dinner, and the waiter comes over and says, would you like a cocktail with your meal? You don't normally have cocktails, but there's one that looks pretty good, and you're thinking about buying it. What are the things that come to mind when you're thinking about making that choice? Well, you may ask yourself, how much does it cost? Fine. You may ask yourself, am I going to be the only one drinking? Will I look like a lush? You may ask yourself, do I have to drive home? Whatever, a bunch of questions you might ask. Now, what's interesting in that is there's a question that the most people in the audience here, pretty much everyone I assume, rarely ask themselves, except maybe the students in the audience. But it's a question that in our data we tend to find the poor ask themselves a lot. And so we've run this experiment, and the way we run this experiment is that we've asked people in the US, and we've done this in India, when you think of buying a television, what do you think of? Just spontaneous free response. And again, the rich say things like, is it a color TV? Is it high def? How many inches does it have? What's the price? The poor say those things too. They care about that as well. But the poor say one other thing. In the cocktail example, what that would be is, if I buy this cocktail, what will I have to give up? In the color television example, it's if I buy this television, what do I have to give up? Think of how funny that is, and that's the best way you can think of the psychology of want versus need. Literally, if you buy that TV, there is something you will have to give up. If you buy this cocktail, there is something you will have to give up. We know that. That's the physical budget constraint. But cognitively, it doesn't feel like there's any budget constraint at all. If you lose $20 from your wallet, you may be annoyed at yourself, but you don't say to yourself, oh no, now I can't buy this thing. That's odd, but that's the psychology of want. That's the ability to have cognitive freedom and to have a lot of slack and to not feel like the needs all crowd against each other. And in fact, I'll show you some data on this. This is data from percentage you might think about. Let's focus on the television. You'll see the low SES, the poor, are in blue, the high SES are in red, and you'll see that the rich are, the above median SES, are much more likely to spontaneously report. We didn't ask them. This is a spontaneous response. What do I give up relative to the poor? Here's another piece of evidence along this. One of the oldest studies in behavioral economics is what's been often referred to as leather jacket calculator. It's such a nice study. It's so easy to run. The way it works, and you should run this with all your undergraduates, it always works. You say to them, you're about to go buy X. What is X? An iPod. It costs $100. As you're about to buy it, the salesman says, for $25 less, it sells at the store's other branch, which is only 15 minutes away. Would you go 15 minutes to save $25 on this iPod? Many people say, yeah, sure. To another group of the other half of your class, you give them the same question. Replace iPod with Mac. Replace $100 with $1,000. Otherwise, the same thing. Would you go 15 minutes to save $25 on this iPod, on this Mac that's worth $1,000? Now, no one would. Who would go 15 minutes to save $25 on a $1,000 purchase? That's just foolish. But it's the same trade-off. $15, $25, 15 minutes. Same trade-off, but different base. And you can replicate this many, many times. We did this for this study. Here you can see this, right? Where is this? You see this right here. This is for, again, the red is the rich, and you can see for the low reference, for the high reference point, they're very unlikely to do it. For the low reference point, they're much more likely to do it. But when we reran this classic study on the poor, what we found, they weren't falling prey to this behavioral manipulation. They understood what $25 means. Whether it's saved on $100 or $1,000, it doesn't affect them. This behavioral bias, they don't show at all. It's not like they always go. They also are busy people, so 60% is the range. It's just unaffected by the frame. Think of how interesting that is. This theory, which we started off along the path to try and explain why the poor do badly, has actually uncovered, actually, on some dimensions, the poor are more rational than you and I will ever be. On what dimension is that? On the thing that's on top of mind for them, which is making ends meet today. They understand what $15 looks like. To them, $15 is a little closer to making rent. $15 is, it's not an abstract number that you divide by 1,000 or by 100 to figure out what it means to you. There's other data like this that we have. For example, let me show you this data. I find this very interesting. In Boston, when you enter the taxi, the meter starts at a certain number. Now, the rich are more likely to take taxis than the poor. But we thought we'd ask people, what is that number when you first get in? And in fact, what you find is the rich have very little idea. The poor know very well. This is just one example. A bunch of other studies show this fact. The poor are much more price knowledgeable than you and I. Again, why? We can afford to not notice or not care. People have done studies in supermarkets where people come outside, as they're coming out, you say to them, hey, do you mind if we talk to you? We have a little survey. Let me get your receipt from you. And then they say, you just bought Colgate toothpaste. How much was it? The poor know pretty precisely. The rich, well, they're like, I think it was $2, maybe $3. I know it was less than $5, I think. You can ask them, what was your entire bill? I think it was 3 digits, maybe high 2 digits, I have no idea. The poor know exactly what their bill was because the poor are very focused. They're very, very much focused. Okay, so that's the leaning that I want to get you to understand is that the key finding is that the poor are much more focused on poverty. The problem with being more focused on poverty and dealing with their situation is that it leaves less cognitive resources for everything else. I'll give you one example. In the psychology literature, we've now come to understand that even something as simple as self-control has something to do with cognitive resources. When you have more cognitive resources, you're able to exercise more self-control. So there's an easy way of thinking about this. This morning, yesterday, you might have seen these cookies. They were like prominent in front of your mind, and you thought, oh, I should eat them. But for those of you who resisted, you probably resisted by using cognitive resources to recruit to mind some of the consequences of eating those cookies. So now the cookies are framed against this. But you can see if you don't have these cognitive resources, there's nothing to offset it, and in effect, you'll look as if you have worse self-control. You don't have worse self-control. You just have less cognitive resources. The best intuition I can give you for this is that think about the times when you have eaten the most junk food in your life. Probably, I can tell you, you were about to work on deadline on something, or you were about to studying for an exam. You're depleted. I can go through some experiment. A beautiful experiment on this, which you can really see, is by Shiv and Fedorkin. They gave subjects a 2-digit number to memorize or a 7-digit number to memorize. And then they told, we're going to ask you in 10 minutes afterwards what it is. And while they were waiting, there happened to be cake and fruit salad in front of them. And the question is, would they eat the cake or the fruit salad? The people trying to remember the 7-digit number were much more likely to eat the cake than the people remembering the 2-digit number. When the mind is loaded, you have less capacity for self-control. And all this means that you have less capacity for any cognitively demanding activity. So you can start to see where this is starting to come together. In effect, what I'm going to try and argue for you is that poverty taxes cognitive resources, makes things loom large in our mind, and as a result, we have less resources for all these other things. So let's go back to our original question. Are the poor dumber? Well, actually, I think this has all made me think, in a way, yes, they are dumber. Not as people. Their cognitive capacity is probably the same. But they're like a computer that has more processes running. So of course, on this process, it's going to be slower and more likely to crash. So how can we test this? Well, before I test this, I want to just emphasize one thing, which I've been hiding a little bit from you. I've been talking about the poor, but you'll notice where I started was hunger and thirst. Those are related to poverty, but not obviously. And then I talked about wants and needs. But wants and needs is not about poverty either. Any form of scarcity will lead to wants and needs, right? What's an example of scarcity that really, I think all of us, or many of us in this room, can understand? I think the easiest one to understand is busyness, having very little time. And let me give you an intuition. You might have had a presentation to do or prepare for Lucia about a month in advance. It wasn't that important. At that time, things like spending time with your children, doing email, those were like wants that all kind of balance against each other. You probably look like a good parent, and you probably look like a responsible email responder. Then you start to run short on time. Now Lucia was looming large. You probably weren't a very good parent in that moment, were you? You certainly weren't a very good email responder. It's an interesting thing. We don't think about it, but we ourselves know this. When we're busy, we are worse parents. And we're worse parents for a very intuitive reason. You go home, you're spending time with your kid. There are moments where you zone out. You don't know what the kid just told you. Why? Because your mind went back to that project that you have coming up due. You may snap at your kid. Why? Because you're frustrated with your project and you're like, that's interesting. So let me just take a minute to show you that, because what I'm about to show you afterwards is sufficiently controversial. I want to emphasize to you that it's not about the poor, it's about scarcity. So the way I'm going to show you this is something kind of funny, and then we'll move to the real meat of the matter. It has to do with Family Feud. Do you guys know what Family Feud is? It's probably the most interesting American game show ever. So Family Feud solves one of the big problems of game shows, which is that game shows really usually cater to people who are fairly boring and tedious, who probably read the almanac in the bathroom, and whom you'd probably never sit next to at a dinner party. That's because who knows the answers to things like this? Some weirdos. Family Feud has solved this problem by saying, here's what we're going to do. We bring contestants in, and we ask them a question. And before we ask them the question, we've asked 100 Americans randomly chosen by Gallup the same question. And now you get points for getting the most common answers. There's no right or wrong. It's democracy. It's the democratization of truth. So an example, I love this one. Name something Barbie could sell if she needed to raise money fast. Anyone want to guess? Oh, I'd love to know what you guys guess. Come on. No one wants to guess? Someone with. Car. Yes, that's number 1. That's pretty good. Any other guesses? Shoes is number 2. And whoever said Ken, number 3. Congratulations. You are in tune with the American mind. Good job. How does all this relate to scarcity? It relates to scarcity because we realized once you decide that poverty is just a special case of having very little, you can start to recreate scarcity in the lab in many ways. And in principle, we should be able to recreate the vendor, her overborrowing at ridiculous interest rates that hurt her in the long run, in many other domains. So we said, why not try it in a totally crazy domain? So we brought people in, undergraduates, who would play Family Feud. And what they would do is when they played Family Feud, they would play many, many rounds. Each round would be a new question. They would earn points each round. And the sum of their points would convert to earnings. So their job, make as many points as possible. We made some of them poor. These were our Family Feud poor. They only had 300 seconds. The others, we made them Family Feud rich. They had 1,000 seconds. And then we allowed all of them to save, just like the vendor, but we changed whether they can borrow or not. In the first experiment, we allowed people to not borrow at all in one group, to borrow at 0 interest, 1 more second this round, 1 less second in the future, or to borrow at 100% interest rate. This is worse than the vendor. What that meant is 1 more second this round, 2 seconds less in the future. What did we find? Well, what we found was it is possible to recreate vegetable vendors using undergraduates in Family Feud, which is give the rich the ability to borrow, and we've run like 30 of these now, and this is pretty consistent. And what you find is you move from left to right, the yellow in the middle turns out to be an anomaly. You tend to find a slight increase The rich do slightly better when they can borrow. So that's the riches on the right, no borrow, borrow 1 to 1, borrow 1 to 2. The rich do slightly better. Not that much better, but borrowing helps them a bit. Give the ability to borrow to the poor, and they just do much worse. They end up over borrowing. And in fact, in another study, same experiment, what we found was we were able to recreate exactly the trap where they were literally borrowing just to stay ahead. And about 50% of their borrowing was to pay off previous borrowing. And they would get stuck in these debt traps. But these were, go back to that big matrix I had. It's hard to tell a story of limited intelligence, limited ability, health, poor, whatever, all of that, when we're talking about Princeton undergraduates who are randomly assigned to being poor or rich. Now, Princeton undergraduates aren't the smartest in the world. They're not Harvard undergrads, but still, it's very hard to tell those stories. Since I have limited time, let me move on and tell you, we've now done many of these things. We've done them not with time, but with, this is called Angry Blueberries, which should look familiar to you. This is like Angry Birds. And here, we gave people scarcity, not in time, but in the number of blueberries they have to shoot at the target. Some people had very few, some people had a lot. And again, we find that give people the ability to borrow, those with many blueberries end up borrowing judiciously. Those with very few blueberries start borrowing and driving themselves into a blueberry debt trap, which, by the way, is a very important social problem. And in the blueberry debt trap, again, you can see, and we saw this in Family Feud, that, yeah, okay, I can show you the data on et cetera, but here's a funny thing that you find here as well. Not only do they drive themselves into debt trap, but remember I told you the poor will look good. In the blueberries game, this is the time they spent aiming and the efficiency of their first shot. You'll notice the poor are actually better with each blueberry. They spend more time aiming, and they hit at a higher rate. The rich, they have a lot of blueberries. They just let loose. So ironically, through one lens, even in blueberries, the poor look very good, but through another lens, they look very bad. And it has to do with the fact that scarcity, in this case, focuses you. Focusing means you do very well here, but you do badly with all the stuff that's outside. Alone is the worst thing in the world for someone very focused. Why? Its benefits fall within the domain you're focusing on. Oh my God, if I only had one blueberry, more blueberry, I could really get those points. Its consequences fall outside. Tomorrow, next round. I'm not thinking about that. I'm really trying to make these ends meet. Okay, so that's scarcity. As I said, I'm going to try and move quite a view across context. So what I'm now going to try and show you in the last 5 minutes is that this is not just about scarcity in the lab. I'm going to keep moving out of the lab and from scarcity to poverty and establish the same thing we've just seen. First, I'm going to do it with something fun. It's a word search. So this is an experiment we ran where we gave subjects a word search like this. They had to find the word street, tree, picture, cloud, whatever. That's what half the subjects saw. The other half the subjects saw this word search: cake, tree, donut, cloud, sweets. You'll see what I've done here. I've brilliantly replaced every other word, street, picture, carpet, with cake, donut, sweets. These are all tempting, tasty words. And what we wanted to know was, if you just saw the word, let's take donut. If you just saw the word donut, how different were you in your performance of finding the word cloud than if you just saw the word picture? Does that make sense to everybody? The common words. What we found is, for one group of subjects, it didn't make much of a difference, non-dieters. But for dieters, if they just saw cake, they were very slow to find the word cloud. They were still thinking about the cake. It's funny, but you can see this is a performance task. There's no borrowing, there's nothing. You can see cognitive compromise here at a very granular level. So now let's keep going up. Let's see how much we can get cognitive compromise. We went to a mall in New Jersey, and there we took people coming in, low income, high income, it's a pretty mixed mall, and we gave them what are very common cognitive capacity tests. The one on the right, many of you may recognize. I think I'm making it very hard for you, aren't I, by moving around all the time? Okay, I'll try to stay in one place, but okay. That's the Raven's progressive matrix test. Do you guys remember this? You probably all took this in 8th grade, and it determined how smart you are. It's a key part of an IQ test. It's things like this where you have to decide which square fits in there. It's one of the elements, and psychologists call this flexible intelligence. It's one of the elements that go into basic IQ testing. The one on the left is a cognitive test